So this is the report of the pre-parikshan test. Around 6,800 aspirants appeared, lesser than last time, I would say, but many had written in the chat box or on the e-learn platform or on the Telegram channel that still they are preparing, still they are not very confident. Their confidence might be shaken. That is why they have not attempted it. But if we look at the performance, 198 marks are exceptional. I would like to congratulate that person. He is ready to, he might have also qualified the interview with such kind of score in the prelims examination, but that's something else. We are looking at the average performances or the performance that will help you in clearing the prelims examination. So that is our real focus here. Let us look at the question difficulty level that you see on your screen. Is everybody able to see the screen? Directly interview. Okay. So we see the difficulty level of the questions on our screen, and we see that here around 24 questions were very tough. Tough questions were 49, average questions were 19, easy and very easy were around 8 questions. Okay, in this paper, out of the 100 questions, this is the analysis based on your performance. We have not decided that this particular question was tough or this was easy or this was very easy or average. It is based on the performance and your attempt. So this is some kind of data that we already have on our hands, which helps us identify that around 24 questions were very tough in this paper. Out of the 100 questions, 76 questions fall into this range of tough, average, easy, and very easy. Okay, these were the questions where you could have maximized with your best level of accuracy. If you attempted these 76 questions properly, and let's say your accuracy level was around, you scored 65 questions properly, you could scored 60 questions properly. And out of these very tough questions, I'm not saying these 24 questions were unsolvable in the paper. That is not that way. Out of these 24 questions also, most of you might have found 8 to 10 questions, or let's say 13, 14 questions doable in the examination scenario. So that is how from 76, you could have improved upon your attempt 85 to 90. That is where the real attempt would lie in the examination. It will almost be between 80 to 90. That is where you can improve upon your score. Then looking at the performance, we have got around 600 to 700 people above the, I would say, 85 marks cutoff, 85 to 95. So if you have scored something between 85 to 95, you guys need to really work on your silly mistakes from here, the choice of question selection. And those who have scored more than 100 marks, they are on the right track. Keep doing this, keep repeating the same performance, and also understand why you got these marks. Also focus on that part. What helped you? What was your strategy? That will also come handy in the real prelims examination. Keep that in mind. Okay. So this is one data that we have. Then I'll also look at the performance of a few students that I have chosen out of the report. And I have found their attempt really well. And that could also help some of our aspirants here who are seeing this video, seeing this discussion, to understand what could be a good strategy for them. So if you see this attempt by an aspirant, he has taken good amount of time, 117 minutes, 120 was the minutes were allocated for this. Out of the 100 questions, this guy has attempted 68 questions correctly. He has skipped 12 questions out of it. 88 question is the attempt. 20 questions are incorrect. His accuracy rate, his or her accuracy rate is perfect. That is 68 correct, 20 incorrect, and this aspirant has decided to skip 12 questions properly. So no need to get into this trap of solving all the 100 questions or something like that. I would consider this as one of the good attempts. I was listening to one of the toppers of past years, Pujya Priyadarshini. She attempted in 2018 only 65 questions in the examination. What was the cutoff that year? It was just 98. So if you are that confident or have that level of accuracy, that is also good. But I would say 80 to 85 is a very decent attempt in tough papers. When the papers are really tough, 80 to 85 or 90 questions. Look at this attempt. It is one of the best attempts, I would say. Out of 100 questions, this candidate has skipped 12 questions, attempted 88, and out of these 88, just 20 questions have been marked incorrectly. What is the score? Score, of course, is around 122, which is way safer. Then we have this candidate. This candidate has scored 110 marks. Attempts are around, what is the number of attempts? Okay, this candidate has skipped 21 questions, attempted around 79 questions. Okay, you can see it here. This candidate has attempted 21 questions are skipped in the paper. Out of the 79 questions that this candidate attempted, 18 were only incorrect. Look at the accuracy rate. That is how, if you focus on your basics, solve the questions that you know, and skip questions wisely. I'm not saying all of you will not attempt more than 90 questions. Some of you will always go for more than 90 questions. That is your particular strategy. But if you go with this kind of agenda, that okay, I'll not touch those questions which I find really risky, or which while solving the mock papers I found, okay, these are the areas where I always commit mistakes. So you can create some kind of strategy similar to that. And this is a big no-no. If you see in this candidate had attempted 98 questions and had skipped only 2 questions. But look at the incorrect questions. There are around 41 incorrect. So that is the level of incorrect, and the score is around 86. Had this person attempted properly, skipped wisely, for example, this candidate had skipped 8 to 9 questions, or let's say 10 questions, and in those remaining 30 questions, he had improved his accuracy by 5 to 7 questions, his score could have been easily above 100 marks. So that is the level of attention to details while solving the paper is required in the prelims examination. Okay, keep that in mind. With this, we'll go straight to the questions that we had in the paper. First, let's start with the tricky questions. Which all questions were tricky? Now, why was this particular question that is here tricky? This was tricky because how many got it correct? 19% only got it correct out of the 5,860 attempts that were there. In these questions, we have been provided or asked question about the National Board for Wildlife. There are 3 statements given. By knowing that, the first statement is incorrect because Prime Minister of India is the head of the National Board for Wildlife. We all know this thing, right? By this, we could attempt A and D. Now we are left with B and C. This is where the real catch comes. So when you're able to eliminate 2 statements confidently, these are the questions that you go on with attempts. That is why we see a lot of attempts are there, but still they were incorrect. But this is bound to happen in the exam. We have seen even with the best attempts, people have marked almost 19 to 20 questions incorrectly. So that should not be a botheration. But in this, if you do a good amount of guess, it will get you into the correct territory. So here, if you had read about the National Board for Wildlife and the members of it, you'll find that Chief of the Army Staff is one of the members of NBWL. Besides this, 5 members from the NGOs, 10 eminent personalities in the field of conservation are also part, and few MPs from Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha are also members. But this was one unique thing that you needed to know. Even if you didn't know, that is why this question was asked in this paper, so that you get additional knowledge beyond the things that you have already covered in your sources or something like that. So that is where, while analyzing the paper, you understand, okay, I could have eliminated these 2 options. Then comes the next 2 questions. Okay, this is the additional knowledge that I have gained from solving this question. This is the way you analyze the paper. Then the next question. This question we have been getting a lot of queries also. The concept of solidarity in social life has been provided in which of the following in the Indian Constitution? Fundamental rights, DPSPs, preamble to the Constitution, fundamental duties. See, these kind of questions will always be there in the examination, which will be where we will have to think with think in very simple terms. Not getting our thoughts complicated while solving such questions is the key to answer these questions correctly in the examination. Now, solidarity has been derived from the concept of fraternity, which the Indian Constitution has drawn from the French Revolution, right? That is why Dr. Ambedkar considered fraternity to be one of the important parts in the Indian preamble, which was required for unity and solidarity in the Indian settings. And clearly, the term fraternity has been mentioned properly in the preamble of the Constitution, and also in the fundamental duties, as we have clearly outlined, that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to promote harmony and the spirit of common brotherhood amongst all the people of India, transcending religious, linguistic, regional, or sectional diversities. Now, some of you have argued that, sir, why isn't the concept of solidarity in social life given in the fundamental rights? And some of you have argued that Article 17 provides for untouchability abolition, right? See, when I ask you a simple question, if you have gone through the previous year questions, you might have solved the question related to right to vote and get elected. Isn't it? It was a question in the prelims examination of 2017. You all have seen that question. Right to vote in India, and the options were, it is a constitutional right, it is a legal right, it is a human right. Now, in various Supreme Court judgments, you might argue that Supreme Court has said that right to vote is a legal right. But when we are preparing, we look at simplistic terms. Where is this provision provided? In the Article 324, we all know that universal adult franchise has been provided in the Indian Constitution. That is why it is a constitutional right. Also, that was picked from our basic NCERT also. That is also one insight that we have by solving this particular question. Okay. So in this question, if you look at this concept of solidarity, the concept of fraternity, it has been specifically outlined in the preamble and the fundamental duties. Although in terms of interpretation, Supreme Court can take the interpretation of fraternity in various other parts of the Constitution also. But that does not meet the demand of this particular question. It is simplistic question based on the basic understanding of the Indian polity here. Okay. So that is how this question could have been solved. Now, this question was pretty interesting. Only 4% aspirants marked it correctly. And we have seen a lot of questions being asked in the previous years in UPSC in the polity section based on these definitions. I have iterated it in the last preparation video also, that you always have to go through the political theory NCERT and the basics of the concepts that are provided in that NCERT. If you are thorough with that, you will be able to solve these questions. Let us look at the options. So in the context of Indian polity, which one of the following would you accept as the most appropriate definition of secularism? First is mutually exclusive relationship between the religion and the state. This is a Western concept where the mutual exclusion between state and religion is there. India does not work that way. In India, we have a different concept of secularism. That's why first statement here is not appropriate or meeting the demand of our question. Okay. Then we have the second statement, respecting religious freedom of the individuals. Yes, this is one part of secularism, but this is not the definition of secularism. This is one part. We understand this is correct, but this does not meet the requirement of our question, which is the most appropriate definition, right? Then the third is that respect towards all established religions and their practices. We all strive for respecting all the established religions that are there, but that does not mean we respect all the practices that are there. Sometimes in the Hinduism, we see that caste system has been provided in the scriptures. So this is one of the practice that has been provided in the scriptures of Hinduism. So are we here to respect the caste hierarchies or the untouchability provided in the caste system? No, that's a clearly big no. And if you had just understood this concept of secularism properly from this basic NCERT, look at this first statement. Secularism is a normative doctrine which seeks to realize a secular society that is one devoid of either interreligious or intra-religious domination. That is why it wants to end or put an opposition to all forms of institutionalized religious domination. If one religion is discriminating against other, that should not be there. If even within a religion, one particular sect is discriminating against other sect, that should also not be there. That is the broadest definition of secularism, just by understanding or going through our basic NCERT book. So again, that is one source that you should have done thoroughly. If you have just gone through it on a cursory level, please go back to it and understand this thing. Okay, I hope this discussion was really fruitful to you. Okay, that's why majority of the aspirants got it wrong. Don't fall for the statements that are given in this option. Some statements might feel that, okay, this is a correct statement, but is it meeting the requirement of the question? What was the question that was asked? Keep that in mind while solving the question. Okay. Perfect. Here we have this question. 20% of the aspirants got it correct. This was the accuracy level. You can see here out of the 5,600 aspirants that attempted it. It is related to communal award, very straightforward thing from our basic books. Communal award, we all have studied. This is what will happen if you don't revise the basic aspects from the history in the examination. That is why the 20% accuracy, as I see in this question, this question should have been solved properly in the examination. These are the questions that you don't mark incorrectly in the examination, provided you have gone through the basic parts of your subject. Okay, so rather than running behind current affairs or unique information at this point, you just have to complete first your basic parts. Then the current affairs also, they need to go side by side. I'm not denying that, but no need to fall for new information that is here. Look at this question. If you look at this third statement, separate electorates to the depressed classes announced in the award was accepted under the Pune Pact. Okay, it was not accepted. Separate electorate was provided in the communal award, but that was not accepted in the Pune Pact. Okay, that's why third is wrong. So obviously D is wrong. Then it was based on the franchise committee that was set up by the government of the British government under the Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, and its name was Lothian Committee. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward fact that is provided in the spectrum also. It's a straightforward fact. Second statement, of course, is correct because it had extended the mandate of separate electorates. Correct answer is 1 and 2. These are the questions that you have to mark correctly in the real examination. Okay. Then again, this question, this is a very interesting question. The accuracy rate is 15%. I would tell you why. Which of the following is or are the possible consequences of overuse of pesticides? Now, majority of the aspirants who have followed the tips and the tricks that we have seen on the YouTube or somewhere, you have seen that, okay, whenever a question related to environment is there, whenever a question related to science is there, all of the above should be the answer, right? And that is how you get 15% accuracy. So don't go with such preconceived notions in the examination. Look at the questions, look at the statements on their merit. First, what is the question asking us? Possible consequence of overuse of pesticides. Fine. First statement, reduce nitrogen fixation in soils. How does the nitrogen fixation take place in the soil in the first place? There are different methods, but one of them is legume that we grow. And in the root system of the legumes, we have the rhizobiums that are symbiotically associated with the roots of the legumes. Pesticides, as they are harmful to all kinds of living insects or the bacteria or everything, that's why they adversely impact the rhizobium in the soil ecosystem. And when the rhizobiums die, the capacity of these symbiotic relationships is reduced to fix the nitrogen in the soil. That's why first is logically correct. Then when we spray pesticides in the agriculture, these pesticides get into the air. Most of the volatile organic compounds get into the air, and they have been found to be responsible for tropospheric ozone pollution. Okay, we are not talking about stratospheric ozone. That is by chlorofluorohydrocarbons. Okay. So 6% of the tropospheric ozone or the ground level ozone is because of the pesticide spray. This is another common fold knowledge. But here, the most important thing was the third statement, eutrophication of lakes. In these options, if you have studied the basic definition of eutrophication from the biology NCERT, what does it say? It says that it is because of nutrient enrichment in the water bodies that the biodiversity is adversely impacted. Okay. So eutrophication takes place because of nutrient enrichment, larger flow of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers into the lakes. And that is how the plant growth increases or the phytoplanktons increase, but the animal life or the zooplanktons are killed, the fish's biodiversity is adversely impacted. So if you knew the definition of eutrophication properly, which is a very straightforward basic fact of environment, you could have eliminated these two options. And that is where the debate of 1 and 2 or 2 is coming. That is how you eliminate options and apply the knowledge that you have acquired while preparing. Revise properly, applied properly in the examination. This brings us to next important question related to science. Now, quantum computing. This is a very difficult question, but just by looking at it, we don't understand what is happening here. Okay, better password than searching for database faster. Okay, quantum computer, I have not read it. I'll skip this question. But whenever you are preparing the science section, it will never ask you question related to any hi-fi theory. It will be about 3 aspects. always when you are studying about the science subject, keep in mind there are three important aspects. First is the application of any particular technology. Second, the benefits that this technology brings. Third, the challenges that are there in the implementation of this particular technology. These are the aspects, or these three are the aspects that are required from a UPSC aspirant and his understanding of this particular science topic. That is it. Okay. Then, if you have studied basics about quantum computing, its applications, and thirdly, the challenges and the benefits. Let us look at the options, fourth and the fifth statement there. The computers will have lower errors, but that is one of the biggest challenge in the deployment of quantum computers. That is, there is possibility of huge amounts of errors in such kind of quantum computers. That is one of the challenges. Look at the explanation. They have very high error states as compared to conventional computers due to decoherence and quantum noise. We don't want to learn about decoherence or quantum noise. We just need to know that, okay, these are prone to errors. Then, by eliminating fourth, we eliminate C and we eliminate all the three, in fact. Also, the fifth statement is pretty straightforward. Can function at room temperatures? No, they function at very high temperatures. That is another challenge that is there in the quantum computer. So, how do we solve this question? We solve this question only by learning about the benefits, challenges, and the application part. And if you are able to eliminate the two out of this, we are able to answer 1, 2, and 3. Also, most of our friends might have thought that in science and technology questions, all the options are correct, but that is not always the case. Don't go with such preconceived mindsets. That is why the paper was tough. The paper was not tough because we had prepared it that way. It was because you went with a preconceived notion and attempted these questions incorrectly rather than applying the knowledge that you had. So these are some of the very tricky questions that were there. Okay. Besides that, I have already outlined that you should have attempted tough, average, easy, and very easy questions properly. Some of the tricky questions, of course, they are part of the tough questions also. So we'll just briefly go through some of the very tough questions. I've already outlined the approach in solving some of the questions and how do you analyze the paper after attempting a mock paper. If you are planning to attempt more number of mock papers, just keep on applying these thoughts or these issues. If you find any query, post them on our eLearn platform, we'll answer them. I'll just go through some of the questions from the very tough section. Okay, we already seen the National Board for Wildlife. Okay, then let's come to this question. Out of the 25 very tough questions we see, this was one question that you either knew or didn't knew in the examination. Okay, you could have easily skipped this question because this is a pretty factual question. If you are aware, that's fine. If you are not aware, you could have skipped this question. No need, no point of guessing it. Majority of you might have got it wrong because Patalkot sounds like Pathankot. It's correct in Punjab and you might have answered it incorrectly. No point of getting into this debate. There are around 18 biodiversity heritage sites. They are declared by different states. They are there on the website portal related to environment of the Government of India. Just go through that. If you are able to remember that, fine. If you're not able to remember, just leave it there. So this question was a part of this paper because we had designed it that you don't attempt this question. You'll leave it here. Even after that, some of our friends have got it correct by Googling it well. So factual questions are pretty easy to answer. Okay, this is the question that I was talking about related to Mauryan Empire. Look at the 4 statements that are there. Consider the following statement. First, during the Mauryan rule, political unity was achieved for the first time in India. The land revenue under Ashoka was fixed at 1/3 of the produce. The censors appears to be a permanent institution. Sunny Dhata was the officer of revenue department. Where will the basic knowledge or the knowledge from the basic NCERT be applied here? I'll just point out those statements here. Look at the 4th question. 4th question is pretty straightforward. It is from the NCERT. Sunny Dhata was the officer of revenue department. No, it was Samharta. Sunny Dhata is the officer of treasury. Okay, so it's chief of the treasury. That's why 4th statement is correct. Eliminated C and D. Fine. Basic knowledge of NCERT we have applied here. Then the land revenue under Ashoka was fixed at 1/3 of the produce. This is also a fact from the NCERT. Not very different, but 1/3 seems to be a very high amount of land revenue under Ashoka period at that time, when we consider that age to be one of the best periods of India's ancient history, right? And it rose to around 40 to 45% or 50% only during the British period. So it was never 1/3 back then. It was around 1/6. If you look at the other periods also, it hovered from 1/6 to 1/5. Okay. So just by understanding of that particular aspect, you could have eliminated the second statement, and then we arrive at the answer. Nothing new in this. It is just the application. It's not a very tough question. It is just if you had revised these things properly. That's why I have focused that static portions should be done very properly before the real prelims examination. Then this is a factual question. You know it or you don't know it. In history, we have been encountering such questions in the real prelims examination also. You either attempt it or you skip it. Okay. Still, if you are able to, if you have prepared the literature part well and the prominent persons in different empires or in different courts, you would have found that Rajshekhara was a part of Gujar Pratihar, which is around 800 to 900 CE. But Harshavardhana was around 650 CE. So some kind of logic could be extended, but that will not come in your mind in the real examination. Skip it. Then this question. This is a pretty interesting question from history or the ancient medieval part. One of the themes that we have identified in the history section is Vijayanagara Empire is UPSC's favorite question, favorite area. Every year in the past 5 to 6 years, one of the question has come up from the Vijayanagara Empire. Okay? Majority of us have prepared the Vijayanagara Empire from NCERTs or somewhere like that. Okay, but all the aspects of Vijayanagara Empire should be prepared properly if a question is being asked. For example, we are preparing Buddhism, we are preparing Jainism, the Bhakti movement, Sufi movement. You might have found a question from all these aspects in this pre-prediction also. That is how we analyze the previous year themes. We have found these themes and we have put up these questions here. Fine. So look at this question. In this, which aspect has been focused on? Now, Vijayanagara Empire was famous for its architecture and the cities that they had built. Who was the greatest in the Vijayanagara Empire? It was Krishnadeva Raya. Krishnadeva Raya, in the mains examination also previously, a question has been asked related to Krishnadeva Raya. That's why, that is how previous year questions and solving them gets you a very good idea. Okay, so first statement here is incorrect. Then second part is about the texts that were authored by Krishnadeva Raya. Another fact. But the most important part in the Vijayanagara Empire, besides the cities and the architecture of Vijayanagara Empire, is the foreign travelers that visited and the account that they have left about the Vijayanagara kingdom. Fine. Previously also UPSC asked a question related to Bernier and Trevernier. You might have gone through that question from history. That was from NCERT. Okay, that was from NCERT, could have been solved. Here also we have seen questions like the presence of slavery in the Vijayanagara kingdom has been attempted by Niccolo di Conti. So he visited the empire and he provided this particular account related to this. This particular account related to tax collected from the prostitutes provided to the police department was provided by Abdul Razak. Okay, so these are the accounts of the foreign travelers that have helped us in understanding and building the history of these empires of that time. Fine, again, we have seen a question related to Sufism. I've already outlined some important themes in the history. Clearly, if you have not gone through the first pre-prediction discussion, just go through it. It is there on the YouTube. There I have already outlined clearly the important themes from different subjects, which all themes are important in science, how to approach the questions in science, in history, in polity, in different subjects. So that will be helpful to you at this point. Then I'll take this last question that is related to environment. This is corporate average fuel efficiency or economy. It is a concept that is highly correlated to Euro 6 norm or the Bharat 6 norms that we see in the news, right? It is related to pollution. Now, as this term has been provided here, it is the particular definition of CAFE or the corporate average fuel efficiency. But interesting fact is that it talks about reducing CO2 emissions, and that is what has been provided in the question. So it's a new concept. It is just for the sake of improving your knowledge here. Even if you couldn't solve this question in the examination, from here you should understand this concept and keep it as a part of your notes for the preparation in the examination. So clearly we have solved here around, let's say 15 to 20 questions, and we have seen the approach of analyzing the paper after you solve the or after you attempt the paper. It is not just looking at the correct answers or the explanations, but what all theme can you draw? Why was this particular question asked? How does it relate to the previous year questions? Or should I prepare that theme or not? Okay, so these are the things that you need to focus. I hope you found this discussion very helpful. Now Baswa sir will take on from here and he will take you through the questions related to economy. And after that, we will have a question answer session We will answer all your queries, concerns, and what all things to do and not do before the prelims examination. Thank you so much.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible? Okay. So Mangal sir has carried out a detailed analysis of the questions from the other subjects. I will be doing it from the perspective of economy. So as far as the important themes, important topics for this year's prelims examination is concerned, I've already discussed the important themes and topics in my discussion on the first pre-prediction test. So in my discussion on the first pre-prediction test, I had clearly highlighted as to which all topics, which all themes are important for this year's prelims examination. So in case if any of you have not gone through the discussion of first pre-prediction test, I suggest you to go through the discussion. It is available on the YouTube. So in that particular test, to start off with, I discussed as to which themes, which topics are important for this year prelims examination. So I'll start off right of my discussion with the first question here. Just like previous year, the previous pre-prediction test, in this pre-prediction test, we had asked almost 25 questions from the Indian economy. Out of these 25 questions, there were at least like 10 to 15 questions which the students had found it to be on the tougher side. So in my discussion, I will be discussing those questions which students have found it to be on the tougher side. The accuracy rate of the students was the lower. So those questions I will be discussing. The first question is about the scheduled banks in India. The question is, which among the following statements related to the scheduled banks is incorrect? Before discussing the answer, let me first highlight as to why we have asked this question in the pre-prediction test. See, recently the Reserve Bank of India has appointed a committee under the leadership of Shyamala Gopinath. The mandate of this particular committee is to receive applications from the private sector entities for the new banking licenses, go through the applications and give recommendations to the RBI as to which all private sector entities can be issued the banking licenses in India. So once these entities are issued with the banking licenses, they will be categorized as the scheduled banks in India. They will be listed under the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. So with respect to the recent development in the banking sector, we could have asked this question in basically two ways. One, we could have directly asked a question related to the current development, that is about the Shyamala Gopinath committee, or we could have asked a conceptual question related to the scheduled banks in India. So as you can see in our pre-prediction test, we had asked a conceptual question about the scheduled banks. So if you have to attempt this question, you need to understand as to what exactly are the scheduled banks and what are their important characteristics. So here, if you look at the structure of banking in India, see, the banks are basically categorized into scheduled banks and non-scheduled banks. The scheduled banks are basically those banks which are listed under the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. In order to get listed under the second schedule, there are certain criteria which is to be fulfilled. First and foremost, you must have studied this in the textbook, that the minimum paid up capital, should be rupees 5 lakhs and above. That's the first criteria. Second criteria is banks should give an undertaking to the RBI that they would operate in the best interest of the depositors. So these are the criteria which has been laid down under the RBI Act 1934 itself. But it does not mean, let's say I want to open a bank. I can't go to the RBI and say, look, I have got 5 lakh rupees. I'm giving an undertaking that I'll operate in the best interest of the depositors. Give me license. That's not how it works. In reality, RBI has come up with more stringent rules and regulations governing the issue of banking licenses. For example, RBI has said that if any entity has to get a banking license, it has to have a capital of rupees 500 crores. Look at the capital of rupees 5 lakhs. This has been laid down under the RBI Act 1934, and this is the minimum thing. But what RBI has said, you need to have 500 crores. Secondly, RBI has said that a particular entity should have a successful track record of being in the banking sector for at least like 10 years. So RBI's rules and regulations are much more stringent. Now, based upon these rules and regulations, last time RBI had issued banking licenses to two banks, IDFC and Bandhan. And now RBI has set up the Shyamala Gopinath committee. The role of this committee would be evaluate the applications and then issue the banking licenses. So if you look at the scheduled banks, basically we have two types, commercial banks and cooperative banks. Within the commercial banks, you have public sector banks, private banks, foreign banks, regional rural banks, which I'm pretty sure you must have studied it already. But look at this part, the last part. Last part is the differentiated banks. Differentiated banks, that is small finance banks and payment banks. The most important thing which you need to understand here is some of the small finance banks and some of the payment banks, they are listed under the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. That is why they are the scheduled banks. Now, for example, if you look at the payment banks, we have payment banks such as Airtel, Paytm, India Post Payment Bank, Fino, etc. Out of these banks, India Post Payment Bank and Fino Payment Bank, they are listed under the second schedule. That is why they are scheduled banks. But if you look at Airtel Payment Bank, Paytm Payment Bank, they are not listed under the second schedule. So they are not scheduled banks. Similarly, I'm pretty sure some of you must have heard about a small finance bank known as Ujjivan. You must have come across that. Now, Ujjivan is a scheduled bank listed under the second schedule of the RBI Act 1934. So if someone had known this particular aspect, that some of the small finance banks and payment banks are also scheduled banks, one would have easily attempted this particular question. Okay, so go back to the question. Which among the following statements related to scheduled banks is incorrect? Okay, so here it says payment banks and small finance banks are not listed as scheduled banks. This is incorrect statement. Okay, some of the small finance banks as well as payment banks are listed as the scheduled banks. I hope this part is clear. Okay, let's move to the next question. Okay, next question is about the concept of on lending. Let me first explain the concept of on lending and then I'll explain as to why we have asked this question in our pre-prediction test. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of priority sector lending. So RBI has identified certain sectors as priority sectors. These include agriculture, micro, small and medium enterprises, education, housing, renewable energy, startups, and so on. So different categories of banks, they are required to fulfill the priority sector lending requirement. For example, for the domestic commercial banks and foreign banks with more than 20 branches, the priority sector lending target is 40%. And subcategorization is 18% for the agriculture, 7.5% for the micro enterprises, and 12% for the weaker sections. This changes depending upon the category. For example, if you look at the urban cooperative banks, right now the target is 40%, but the idea is to increase the target to 75% after March 31st, 2024. Now, if a bank has to fulfill this priority sector lending target, bank can do so in basically two ways. One, bank can directly lend to these sectors. That's the first way. Second, banks can give money or lend money to NBFCs as well as microfinance institutions. And this money will be then lent to the priority sectors. I repeat, banks lend money to NBFCs and microfinance institutions who then forward that particular money or lend that particular money to priority sectors. This is the concept of on lending. I hope you understood this. Now, why we have asked this question in our pre-prediction test? This concept of on lending right now, it is applicable only for domestic commercial banks as well as foreign banks. It is not applicable to RRBs, small finance banks, and urban cooperative banks, which means these banks cannot avail the facility of on lending. But recently, RBI has come up with a notification and it has allowed the concept of on lending for the small finance banks only, which means going forward, RRBs and urban cooperative banks cannot avail the facility of on lending. But this on lending facility can be availed by the small finance banks, foreign banks, and domestic commercial banks. So this is an important development which has taken place in the banking sector. And that is why we had asked this question in our pre-prediction test. So if you read this statement here, which among the following best describe the concept of on lending in the banking sector? It is basically the loans sanctioned by the banks to NBFCs for onward lending to the priority sectors. This is the first one. I hope it is clear. Okay. Okay. Next was a very conceptual question. Question was, if GVA at basic prices of a particular country, if this is higher than GDP at market prices, what does it denote? I hope all of you must have known about the concept of GDP, gross domestic product, which refers to the market value of all final goods and services. Now this GDP, it can be measured at three different levels. One, it can be measured at factor cost. Two, it can be measured at basic prices. And three, it can be measured at the market prices. Please understand here, when I measure GDP at basic prices, I can also call this as GVA at basic prices. Both are same. There's no difference. I'm repeating this once again. GDP at basic price and GVA at basic price, both are same. Now, what is the difference between these three things? See, when I say factor cost basically include the cost of factors of production. Factors of production such as land, labor, capital, and so on. Now, for example, let's say I want to manufacture this marker. To manufacture this marker, I need to buy land. I need to pay wages to the employees. I need to invest capital. How much of investment is needed with respect to factors of production to manufacture this marker? That will tell me the factor cost. Let's say to manufacture this marker, my cost of factors of production is ₹10. So that will become my GDP at factor cost. When I say basic prices is basically the price which I as a manufacturer am expected to receive when I sell this marker. How much price will I get on selling this marker? This is from the perspective of a manufacturer. And let's say in this particular case, it is ₹12. When I say GDP at market price, here I am measuring the price from the perspective of consumer. How much price the consumer is paying in order to buy this marker. And this could be ₹15. So please look at this. When I say GDP at factor cost, how much money is needed in order to manufacture this marker? When I say GDP at basic price, how much price am I expected to receive when I sell this marker? I'm a manufacturer here. Market prices, how much price a consumer is expected to pay on buying this marker. Now, to understand this distinction in a much better manner, you can have a look at this particular flow chart here. So basically, these are the factors of production: land, labor, capital. This will give me GDP at factor cost. Let's say I have invested total ₹100 for the factors of production. So my GDP at factor cost here would become equal to ₹100. Now, when I'm manufacturing this product, I am required to pay something known as production taxes, which a manufacturer will be required to pay. So when I say production taxes are basically taxes which we pay on factors of production. The taxes which you pay on, say, land, the taxes which you pay on labor. For example, if I have to buy a land, I'll be required to pay stamp duty. I'll be required to pay the registration tax, right? So this becomes my production taxes, the tax which I pay on the factors of production. As far as production subsidies is concerned, production subsidies is the subsidies which I get for these factors of production. Now, for example, government may provide me with a subsidized land. This becomes a production subsidy. Or government may provide me loans at a lower rate of interest. This becomes a production subsidy here. I hope you're getting this, right? So I, as a manufacturer, I will receive production subsidies from the government. and I will pay production taxes to the government. So now, if you want to calculate as to what is a basic price, how much price am I expected to receive? That will be GDP at factor cost plus production taxes minus production subsidies. Now, for example, let's say in this case, the production taxes is 200 and production subsidies is 100. So 100 plus 200 minus 100, that will give me the GDP at basic price. Okay. Now coming to next level of market price. Now at the next level, here, when a product is sold in the market, consumers would be required to pay product taxes. Please understand the difference here. When I say production taxes are the taxes which are paid by the manufacturers on the factors of production. Product taxes are the taxes which the consumers would pay on buying of various products. The best example happens to be GST. GST is a product tax. Apart from that, the consumers also receive subsidies on various products from the government, right? For example, the government provides LPG subsidy, food subsidy, and so on. So if you want to calculate GDP at market price, it will be GDP at basic price plus product taxes minus product subsidies. So that is the relationship. So if I have to summarize here, the various aspects of the relationship between factor cost, GDP at basic price, and GDP at market price, it is there in front of your screen. As you can see, GDP at market price, this will be GDP at basic price, which I discussed, plus the product taxes minus the product subsidies. This product taxes minus product subsidies, I can call this as net value of indirect taxes. So that is the relationship. Now I can just concentrate on the last formula here. If this net indirect taxes, let's say it is positive. If it is positive, what does this mean? This means that my product taxes is higher than my product subsidies. And if this is positive, my GDP at market price will be higher than GDP at basic price, right? Because you're adding a positive value. On the other hand, if this net indirect taxes, if it is negative, what does this mean? This means that my product taxes is lower than the product subsidies. So this will become negative value. And if it becomes negative, my GDP at basic price will be higher than GDP at market price. So this question which we had asked in pre-prediction test, it was very conceptual question. If someone had an understanding of how GDP at factor cost, GDP at basic price, and GDP at market price is calculated, they would have easily attempted this question. One would have simply substituted a formula for GDP at market price is equal to GDP at basic price plus net indirect taxes, would have got the right answer. I hope you are clear. So if you go back to the question which we had asked in the pre-prediction test, if the GVA, as I discussed, if the GVA at basic prices, as I said, GVA at basic price is same as GDP at basic price, both are same. And if this GVA at basic price is more than the GDP at market price, it shows that the value of indirect taxes is negative. Okay. So once again, as I said, conceptual question, required understanding of how GDP is calculated at different levels, factor cost, basic price, and market price. Okay, next question is about monetization of government's deficit. The accuracy rate of the students was extremely lower here. Only 12% of the students were able to get the right answer. But what is also equally surprising is number of attempts. A large number of people attempted this question. So let's understand as to where people could have gone wrong with respect to monetization of government's deficit. Now let's say the government is set to earn rupees 100 in the form of tax and non-tax revenue. This is the government's revenue which the government is going to earn. But let's say the expenditure obligations on the government is 150. This is the money which the government has to spend. So how much is the shortfall here? How much shortfall the government is having? Government is having a shortfall of rupees 50. From where is the government meeting the shortfall now? Now the government is meeting the shortfall by borrowing the money from the market. And how it is borrowing the money? It is borrowing the money from the market through the issuance of treasury bills as well as dated bonds, which we together call them as government securities. So right now, whenever the government is in deficit, government has to spend more than what it earns. Government borrows the money from the market through the issuance of the government securities. That's what we know. But if this same 50 rupees, if the government decides to borrow from the Reserve Bank of India, we will call this as monetization of government's deficit. So please understand here the purpose for which the government is borrowing money. The government is borrowing money in order to finance its deficit, the deficit of rupees 50. So if it is borrowing this 50 rupees from the RBI, we would call that as monetization of the government's deficit. I hope we are clear so far. Okay. Now, just imagine if you give this facility to the government to borrow the money from the RBI to finance its deficit. The government will keep on borrowing money from the RBI repeatedly, right? And if the government keep on borrowing money from the RBI repeatedly, obviously this will lead to increase in the money supply. It will lead to increase in rate of inflation. That's the first thing. Secondly, if the government is being given the freedom to borrow the money from the RBI whenever it wants to, this will lead to increase in fiscal deficit, right? More of borrowings. It will lead to increase in public debt. So tell me, should there be restrictions on monetization deficit or not? Yes. We should have restrictions on monetization of the government's deficit. What are the restrictions? These restrictions have been laid down under the FRBM Act 2003. What are these restrictions? First and foremost, the FRBM Act 2003 says that if the government wants to borrow money from the RBI, government can borrow short-term loans, but these short-term loans should not be used for financing government's deficit, not for deficit financing. These short-term loans can be borrowed by the government in order to address temporary mismatches in the cash balances. So whenever there are temporary mismatches in the cash balances, the government can borrow money from the RBI. And some of you already know as to what is this tool known as. This tool is known as ways and means advances. So ways and means advances is allowed, where the government can borrow money, short-term loans, in order to address the temporary mismatches in its cash balances. That is allowed. Second, the FRBM Act 2003 says that the government, under normal circumstances, it should not borrow money in order to bridge its deficit. Under normal circumstances, the government cannot borrow money from the RBI in order to finance its deficit. But at the same time, under certain exceptional circumstances, which has been provided under the FRBM Act itself, borrowing is allowed. Borrowing is allowed under certain exceptional circumstances, where this borrowing can be used in order to bridge the government's deficit. Now, what are these exceptional circumstances? Exceptional circumstances include national security, war, collapse of agriculture, decline in the GDP growth rate, and so on. So under these exceptional circumstances, the government can very well borrow money from the RBI to finance its deficit. The reason as to why I'm stressing on this particular aspect is, if you read some of the newspapers or some of the content, in these newspapers and some of the content which is available on the internet, it has been mentioned that monetization of government's deficit is completely prohibited. Is it completely prohibited? No, it is not completely prohibited, but there are certain restrictions with respect to monetization of government's deficit. Government can undertake the deficit financing under certain exceptional circumstances. In order to further substantiate my point of view, I hope most of you must be knowing that under the FRBM Act, the fiscal deficit has to maintain at 3% of the India's GDP, right? But at the same time, under certain exceptional circumstances, the fiscal deficit can increase by 0.5%, which means the fiscal deficit can be at 3.5%. And once again, these exceptional circumstances include national security, war, collapse of agriculture, decline in the GDP growth rate, and so on. I hope we are clear with this. Okay. This is the most important thing which you must know with respect to monetization of government's deficit. And once again, we do feel that this topic of monetization of government's deficit is important for the upcoming prelims examination, because last year, a number of economists, they are putting forward this proposal to the government that the government should probably start monetizing its deficit because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. That is why this particular topic is quite important. So you can look at the statements which are given here. It includes both short-term and long-term loans given by the RBI to the government directly. So here, this statement is incorrect because when I say short-term loans to the government directly, it also includes ways and means advances, right? Ways and means advances are not given to monetize the government's deficit. The ways and means advances are given in order to address temporary mismatches in the cash balances. Under the FRBM Act, the government can borrow long-term loans from the RBI directly. As I said, it's an enabling clause. That is why this statement here is correct. I hope we are clear with this, all of you. Okay, coming to next one. The next one is about mining sector. Okay, consider following statements related to the mining sector in India. The reason as to why we had asked this question in the pre-prediction test was because of the passage of Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Amendment Act 2021 by the Parliament recently. So recently Parliament has passed this particular act, and that is why mining sector as such becomes quite important. So rather than directly asking the provisions of the new Amendment Act, we had asked a conceptual question related to the mining sector. And this question is also important because previously also at least twice or thrice questions have been asked with respect to the mining sector in the previous year prelims. So let's understand this about the mining sector quickly. Okay. See, in case of India, we have Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act 1957, which is the main law passed by the center in order to develop and regulate the mining sector. The MMDR Act 1957 lays down the roles and responsibilities of the center and the states with respect to the mining sector. Under this MMDR Act, basically, the minerals are categorized into two types. One, major minerals and the minor minerals. Some of the major minerals include coal, iron ore, lignite, gold, bauxite, etc. And some of the minor minerals include sand, clay, building stones, etc. The MMDR Act itself has come out with a list of what constitutes a major mineral and what constitutes a minor mineral. With respect to the major minerals, the responsibility lies with the central government. With respect to minor minerals, the responsibility lies with the concerned state government. When I say responsibility here means they will make all the necessary rules and regulations as to how these mines will be allocated, how they will be extracted. All the necessary rules and regulations will be laid down by the center in case of the major minerals. And in case of minor minerals, it is the respective state government making of rules, regulation. Apart from the regulation, there is another concept of ownership. Ownership means who owns the minerals in India. Who is owning the minerals? That is very important. Please understand the difference. Here we are talking about who can make rules and regulations. Here we are talking about who is the owner of the minerals. With respect to ownership, the MMDR Act says that the central government will be the owners of all the minerals underlying the ocean up to exclusive economic zone. The central government is the owner of all of these minerals, which are below the ocean up to exclusive economic zone. As far as state governments are concerned, the state governments are owner of both major minerals as well as minor minerals within their respective territorial boundaries. This is very important. Within the respective territorial boundaries, who is the owner? It is the respective state government. Okay. For example, when I say coal, who can make rules and regulations with respect to coal? The rules and regulations will be made by center. But who is the owner here? The ownership lies with the concerned state government. So if let's say in case of Jharkhand, there's a coal mine. Who owns the coal mine? The coal mine will be owned by the respective state government, Jharkhand in this case. But who will make rules and regulations? The central government. Apart from this, we have a concept of royalty. See, whenever we allocate a mine, the entity which is extracting the minerals is required to pay the royalty. In case of major minerals, the royalty will be fixed by the center, because obviously center is making rules and regulations, but it will be collected by the states because the states are the owners here. Royalty is fixed by the center, but collected by the state governments. In case of minor minerals, royalty is both fixed as well as collected by the respective state government. So this is a very important aspect about how the mining sector is being regulated in India. So under MMDR Act, we have major minerals, minor minerals. Central government will make all the rules and regulations related to major minerals. State government will make the rules and regulations with respect to minor minerals. The central government owns all the minerals underlying the ocean up to the exclusive economic zone. The state government owns both major and minor minerals within their respective territorial boundaries. For the major minerals, royalty is fixed by whom? Center. But who will collect the royalty? State government. For the minor minerals, royalty is fixed as well as collected by the state government. So this is a basic provision of the MMDR Act 1957. As I said, recently Parliament has passed the MMDR Regulation Act 2021. All of you must have gone through the current affairs, right? So instead of asking a direct question from the current affairs, we had asked this conceptual question about the regulation of the mining sector in India. So if you go back to the question here, the state governments are the owners of the minerals located within their respective boundaries, while the central government owns the minerals underlying the ocean, correct? The royalty on the major minerals is fixed and collected by the center. As I said, the first part of the statement is wrong here, because royalty on the major minerals is fixed by the center, but collected by the state governments. So the right answer should be A, that is one only. Okay. Now coming to next one, consider following statements related to the agreements under the World Trade Organization. Under the World Trade Organization, basically we come across two types of agreements: multilateral agreements and plurilateral agreements. So multilateral agreements are basically those agreements which are adopted through consensus among all the WTO member countries. So all the WTO member countries come together and they adopt the multilateral agreements, and these multilateral agreements will be applicable to all the WTO member countries. But at the same time, these multilateral agreements have certain special and differential treatment. Special and differential treatment means certain benefits are given to poor and developing countries. For example, if you look at TRIPS agreement actually came into being in the year 1995. But when did India start implementing TRIPS? We started implementing TRIPS after 10 years, that is in the year 2005. So we got a longer time frame to implement the WTO agreement, because this is one of the special and differential treatment under the TRIPS agreement. Similarly, under the agreement on agriculture, as you know, developing countries such as India, they have been allowed to give more amount of subsidies in comparison to the developed economies. So these multilateral agreements have special and differential treatment. So the WTO agreements which we have come across, agreement on agriculture, TRIPS, etc., they are examples of the multilateral agreements. Plurilateral agreements, on the other hand, are those agreements which are adopted only by few countries. So whichever country adopts those agreements, only to those countries, the plurilateral agreements would be applicable. They're not applicable to all. More importantly, the plurilateral agreements as such, they will not have any kind of special and differential treatment, no special privileges, no special benefits for poor and developing countries. Some of the examples include the information technology agreement, government procurement, and so on. Now, as to why we have asked this question in our pre-prediction test. See, some of the developed economies such as US, Japan, etc., they are trying to negotiate certain plurilateral agreements. For example, one of the plurilateral agreement which they are negotiating right now is the agreement on e-commerce. They are right now negotiating. But India as such is not in favor of plurilateral agreements. India is in favor of multilateral agreements. Ask me why? Because multilateral agreements, as I said, they give certain special privileges and benefits to developing countries such as India. But plurilateral agreements do not give benefits. They do not give privileges to India. India is in favor of multilateral agreements, but some developed economies such as US, they are in favor of plurilateral agreement. So they are right now negotiating an agreement on e-commerce. All of these things, these developments have been taking place in the last 1 to 1.5 years. So UPSC could probably ask you a question on the conceptual understanding about multilateral and plurilateral agreements. That is why we had asked this question in our pre-prediction test. Okay, so you can see here, both multilateral and plurilateral agreements are adopted through consensus among the member countries. No, the multilateral agreements are applicable to all the member countries, while the plurilateral agreements are applicable to certain member countries. Correct. Presently, there are no plurilateral agreements. Wrong. So the right answer B, 2 only. Okay. Okay. Now coming to the next question, voluntary retention route, which was in news recently. Voluntary retention route is a new route which the RBI has come out with in the year 2019. This is a route for attracting more of foreign investment, that is FPIs, more of FPIs into our debt market. So it's a new route for the FPIs to invest in the debt market. So right answer is B here. So these details about the developments which are taken place in the capital market, these developments we have incorporated in the prelims compass. So in case if anyone had gone through the prelims compass, they would have easily attempted this question. Next was a very simple question about the concept of inflation tax. Very simple question, but still the accuracy rate of the students was very lower. Only 27% of students could get the right answer to this question. I hope you know that whenever there is an increase in the rate of inflation, whenever the prices of goods and services increase, what will happen to purchasing power of currency? Purchasing power of the currency reduces, right? This decrease in purchasing power of the currency due to higher rate of inflation is nothing but inflation tax. Inflation tax has nothing to do with the payment of taxes. It is actually a loss suffered by the people who keep cash, especially when the rate of inflation is higher. So very simple question, but still the accuracy rate was lower. People could have probably confused between the concept of inflation tax and inflation premium. That is where people would have committed mistake. If you look at the concept of inflation premium basically means, see, whenever there's an increase in rate of inflation, right? What will RBI do? RBI will increase the rate of interest on loans, right? To suck out the excess supply. So earlier, let's say the rate of interest on loan was 5%, but now the rate of interest on loan has increased to 7%, right? So now if I want to take loan, can I say I am required to pay 2% more rate of interest? So this higher rate of interest which I am required to pay on taking loans, this we can call it as inflation premium. Okay. Whereas inflation tax is a loss suffered by the people who keep cash when the rate of inflation is higher. So this is the answer. So as I said at the start of our discussion, we had asked 25 questions in the Indian economy. Out of these 25 questions, these are some of the questions where I found that the students had committed mistakes. And this is what is a discussion so far. And in case if you want to know the important themes, important topics for the upcoming prelims examination, please go back and watch my discussion on the first pre-prediction test, wherein at the start of the discussion, I've highlighted as to which are the important themes, important topics, and how you should you approach Indian economy for your prelims preparation. For other subjects also, you can have to go to the first preparation discussion. Okay, fine. So this ends our discussion. So in case if you have any queries, you can start asking your queries.